If you have been following the evolution of Linux gaming over the past few years, you already know that something remarkable has been happening beneath the surface. What once felt like a niche hobby for enthusiasts compiling kernels and tweaking configuration files has steadily transformed into a serious platform for modern gaming. And now, a new development suggests that one of the biggest names in graphics technology is paying closer attention than ever before. Nvidia has started listing new job positions that are explicitly focused on Linux gaming, Vulkan optimization, and graphics engineering tied directly to Valve's Proton ecosystem. For anyone who has been watching this space grow, this feels less like a surprise and more like an overdue acknowledgement of reality. For a long time, the narrative around Linux gaming revolved around limitations. Windows dominated the PC gaming landscape, and Linux users often relied on dual-boot setups or compatibility layers just to play mainstream titles. But everything began to shift when Valve made a bold strategic move. Instead of continuing to treat Linux as a secondary platform, Valve chose Linux as the foundation for SteamOS, the operating system that powers the Steam Deck. That decision changed the trajectory of Linux gaming overnight. Suddenly, a major hardware product was built on top of Linux, and millions of gamers were introduced to a Linux-based gaming environment without even realizing it. At the heart of that transformation is Proton, the compatibility layer developed by Valve that builds on top of Wine and integrates technologies like DXVK and VKD3D to translate DirectX calls into Vulkan. Proton essentially allows Windows games to run on Linux with impressive performance and compatibility. Over time, Proton has matured into a robust ecosystem, with thousands of games now playable on Linux with minimal configuration. For many players, clicking install and hitting play just works. That is a dramatic departure from the old days of manual tweaks and command-line troubleshooting. For Nvidia, this shift represents both an opportunity and a challenge. Historically, Nvidia has maintained Linux drivers, and in many cases their proprietary drivers have offered strong performance. However, the company's relationship with Linux has often felt complicated. There were periods when driver support lagged behind expectations, and open-source advocates frequently criticized Nvidia for not embracing open development in the same way that some competitors did. Meanwhile, AMD steadily gained praise for its open-source driver stack, which integrates deeply with the Linux kernel and Mesa graphics stack. In the eyes of many Linux users, AMD became synonymous with plug-and-play graphics on Linux. Now NVIDIA's recent job listings suggest a renewed focus. These roles are not generic driver engineering positions. They are explicitly tied to Vulkan graphics optimization, Linux graphics engineering, and improving the gaming experience under Linux environments like SteamOS. The wording of these listings makes it clear that Proton compatibility and gaming workloads are in their sights. That is significant. It signals that Linux gaming is no longer a fringe use case from NVIDIA's perspective. It is a platform worth dedicating specialized talent to. To understand why this matters, we need to talk about Vulkan. Vulkan is a modern, low-overhead graphics API that gives developers fine-grained control over GPU resources. It is cross-platform and well-suited to high-performance gaming. Proton relies heavily on Vulkan to translate DirectX 9, 10, 11, and even DirectX 12 calls into something that can run efficiently on Linux. That translation layer is only as good as the underlying Vulkan driver implementation. If the Vulkan drivers are poorly optimized, the entire gaming experience suffers. Frame rates drop, stutters appear, and compatibility issues multiply. By hiring engineers specifically focused on Vulkan optimization for Linux gaming, Nvidia appears to be acknowledging that driver-level performance tuning is critical. This is not just about supporting Linux in theory. It is about squeezing every ounce of performance out of the GPU when running Windows titles through Proton. It is about minimizing overhead, reducing shader compilation stutter, and ensuring that new game releases work as seamlessly as possible. It is also worth remembering that the Steam Deck uses AMD hardware. That fact alone reshaped market dynamics. When Valve designed the Steam Deck, they partnered with AMD for a custom APU. That meant that the out-of-the-box SteamOS experience was built and optimized around AMD's graphics stack. Nvidia was, in effect, outside that initial hardware ecosystem. For desktop Linux users, running Nvidia GPUs, SteamOS and Proton still worked, but the hardware synergy was not the same as on AMD-based systems. Now, As Valve continues to refine SteamOS, and as rumors circulate about potential future hardware expansions or licensing SteamOS to third-party manufacturers, the importance of robust Nvidia support becomes more obvious. If SteamOS expands beyond the Steam Deck and begins appearing on other devices, laptops, or even desktop pre-installs, Nvidia will want to ensure its GPUs deliver top-tier performance in that environment. Strengthening Linux driver teams now positions Nvidia to compete more effectively in that evolving ecosystem. Another angle to consider is the broader industry shift toward cross-platform gaming. Game developers are increasingly targeting multiple operating systems and devices. Vulkan's cross-platform nature makes it appealing, and Proton lowers the barrier for Windows-only games to reach Linux users. If Nvidia can optimize its Linux stack to perform nearly identically to Windows in gaming scenarios, the distinction between operating systems becomes less relevant to the end user. That is a powerful outcome. It reduces friction, increases user satisfaction, and potentially expands the overall PC gaming market. For AMD, this development is interesting. For years, AMD has been praised within the Linux community for its open-source drivers and strong Mesa integration. Many Linux enthusiasts specifically recommended AMD GPUs for hassle-free experiences. With Nvidia now stepping up its Linux gaming focus, AMD may face stronger competition in a space where it previously enjoyed a reputational advantage. That does not mean AMD is at risk of losing its standing overnight, but it does mean that Nvidia is signaling it wants a larger share of mind and market among Linux gamers. There is also a reputational component here. The Linux community has long memories, past frustrations with proprietary drivers, kernel compatibility issues, and delayed feature support have shaped perceptions. By actively hiring Linux graphics engineers and Vulkan specialists, Nvidia sends a message that it is taking this audience seriously. Over time, consistent driver improvements, faster bug fixes, and visible engagement with the Linux ecosystem could help rebuild trust. One cannot ignore the commercial logic either. The Steam Deck has reportedly sold millions of units. Each unit represents a Linux-based gaming device in a consumer's hands. As more people experience Linux gaming through SteamOS, the stigma that Linux is not for gaming fades. If even a fraction of those users later build or upgrade desktop PCs, their expectations will include smooth Linux compatibility. Nvidia wants to be ready for that scenario. It wants those customers to consider Jaffe's GPUs viable and optimized choices for Linux. The specific mention of Proton-related work in job listings underscores how central that compatibility layer has become. Proton is no longer an experiment, it is infrastructure. It bridges the gap between the Windows-dominated game library and the Linux operating system. If Nvidia engineers can collaborate indirectly or directly with the broader Proton ecosystem by improving driver-level interactions, the end result benefits everyone: gamers, developers, and hardware vendors. Performance parity with Windows is another major factor. Historically, some Linux gamers observed slightly lower performance compared to Windows on identical hardware. While the gap has narrowed significantly, perception lingers. By investing in Linux-focused optimization, Nvidia could help close that gap further. If benchmarks begin to show near-identical performance between Windows and Linux on Nvidia GPUs, the psychological barrier to switching shrinks dramatically. Beyond gaming, strengthening Linux graphics engineering also has benefits in adjacent markets. Linux is dominant in servers, AI workloads, and high-performance computing. Nvidia is already a major player in those sectors with CUDA and AI accelerators. By unifying and strengthening its Linux expertise across consumer gaming and enterprise workloads, Nvidia can maintain a cohesive software strategy. Engineers working on Vulkan and driver optimization may contribute knowledge that improves the entire Linux graphics ecosystem. There is also the open source angle. Nvidia has recently taken steps toward open sourcing portions of its GPU kernel modules. While the full stack is not entirely open, this shift marked a notable change in approach. Hiring more Linux engineers could accelerate collaboration with the broader open source community, leading to better integration with the Linux kernel, Wayland compositors, and Mesa where applicable. Even incremental improvements in these areas can dramatically improve day-to-day usability for Linux desktop users. From a competitive standpoint, Microsoft's push toward making Windows more service-oriented and cloud-integrated has left some traditional desktop users feeling constrained. Linux offers an alternative built around user control and customization. Gaming was long considered the Achilles heel of that alternative. Proton, SteamOS, and now increasing vendor support are systematically dismantling that weakness. NVIDIA's job listings can be seen as another domino falling in that broader shift. It is fascinating to think about how quickly the narrative has changed. A decade ago, major GPU vendors hiring specifically for Linux gaming roles would have seemed unlikely. Today, it feels almost inevitable. The growth of open-source tooling, the rise of Vulkan, and Valve's strategic investments created momentum that hardware companies can no longer ignore. For the Linux Chronicle audience, this development is more than corporate news. It is validation. It validates years of advocacy, experimentation, and community-driven progress. It suggests that Linux gaming is not just surviving, it is thriving to the point where industry giants are dedicating specialized resources to compete and optimize within it. Looking forward, the real test will be execution. Job listings are a signal of intent, not a guarantee of results. The Linux community will be watching driver updates, Vulkan performance improvements, and Proton compatibility reports closely. Tangible gains in stability and frame rates will matter far more than announcements, but the direction is clear. NVIDIA's move also raises interesting possibilities for collaboration. Could closer alignment between NVIDIA's driver team and Valve's Proton developers lead to faster fixes for newly released games? Could shader catching, pipeline optimization, and frame pacing improvements be rolled out more quickly? The potential upside is substantial. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is the normalization of Linux as a first-class gaming platform. Valve planted the flag by choosing Linux as the foundation for SteamOS. Proton made the massive Windows game library accessible. AMD capitalized early with strong open-source driver support. And now Nvidia appears ready to deepen its commitment and compete aggressively in this space. For gamers, competition is good. It drives innovation, performance gains, and better support. If Nvidia and AMD both invest heavily in optimizing Linux gaming experiences, users win. Frame rates improve, bugs get squashed faster, new features arrive sooner. The platform as a whole becomes more robust. As this story unfolds, it will be important to track how NVIDIA's Linux-focused hires translate into real-world outcomes. Will we see measurable improvements in Vulkan performance under Proton? Will day-one game compatibility improve for Nvidia users on Linux? Will the perception gap between AMD and Nvidia in the Linux community narrow? One thing is certain. Linux gaming is no longer an afterthought. It is a strategic frontier, and when a company the size of Nvidia begins hiring specifically to target that frontier, it signals that the momentum behind Linux gaming is not just a passing trend, it is a structural shift in the PC gaming landscape. For Linux Chronicle viewers, this is the kind of evolution that makes covering Linux so exciting. What once felt experimental now feels mainstream. What once required workarounds now feels seamless. And what once seemed unlikely now feels inevitable. NVIDIA's job listings are more than recruitment notices. They are markers of an industry adapting to a world where Linux is not just an alternative, but a serious contender in gaming.